By first light, the field was no longer a battlefield. It was a workshop. Mist hung over the low ground, thick and silent, smothering the sounds of the men who moved among the men who no longer moved. The air carried iron and wet earth. No trumpets, no steel on steel. Only the tearing of cloth, the low grunt of a boot rolling a body onto its back, and the steady scrape of knives. These were not the blades of warriors. They belonged to scavengers. They cut straps, slit purses, worked rings off fingers already stiff. Small groups moved with the calm of men who had done this many times. They turned a corpse over not to check for breath, but to see what lay beneath it. This was not grief. It was an inventory, a harvest. One body among hundreds waits at the edge of a fresh pit. He has been stripped of everything, the plates that were his identity, the surcoat that shouted his name and his lord across a battlefield. Gone, already stacked on a cart, already property of someone else. Without the shell that defined him, he is only a man, pale, nameless, beginning to change. His name is lost, his story is not. It is written into his own bones, plain enough for anyone willing to read it. There is a crushed hollow in the side of his skull, where one heavy blow drove the bone inward. His knee has burst into a spray of fractures, an injury meant not to kill, but to cripple, to pin him to the ground. And the smallest marks tell the most. A cluster of narrow punctures below the jaw and through the thin bone behind the eye. These are not sword cuts. They are not battle wounds at all. This skeleton is our first piece of evidence. The man who wore it was born into a world that promised him he could not be beaten, a creature of iron and honor. He died in the mud, battered, then finished with a tool built for the job. For the next hour, we are not storytellers. We are investigators. We lay this body on the table and work backward, reading the physical record that survived the day it died. We examine the armor that failed him, a machine of protection that became a cage. And we open the killer's own manual, a training text that lays out step by step how a knight was taken apart. The poets sang of chivalry. The bones say something else. They speak of a cold trade, a business with prices and profits, and a myth built to hide it. Let us know in the comments which city and country you're watching from. And if you believe these stories deserve to be told, take a moment to subscribe and support the project. You're watching Ancestral, the best dark history channel in the world. Put the skeleton on the table and the story begins with physics, not steel. A forensic anthropologist reading these bones, the kind pulled from the mass graves at Towton, where the fighting fell on Palm Sunday, the 29th of March, 1461, in a snowstorm blowing straight into the faces of the Lancastrian line, starts with what is missing. Nobody expects an absence, yet the wound everyone imagines is the wound that is barely there. Clean cuts from a blade edge are rare on the men dug from that Yorkshire clay in 1996, when a work crew laying foundations near Towton Hall broke into a pit and found bodies packed shoulder to shoulder, 37 of them, layered like the pages of a closed book. That absence is the first fact, and it changes everything that follows. A sword did its work on flesh and mail. Against the hardened plate of the 15th century, a sword was the wrong tool for the job. A fine chisel brought to break a millstone. So the violence written into these bones is a different kind, not elegant, not the arc of a slash. It is blunt, concussive, bone-shattering force, delivered again and again by men who had learned exactly where to put it. The battle itself gives the bones their setting. Chroniclers put the two armies at numbers no medieval field had seen. The heralds' count that reached Edward the War afterward claimed some 28,000 dead, a figure copied into a letter George Neville sent to the papal legate Copini within days. Whatever the true toll, the Crowland chronicler wrote that blood ran in the melting snow, and that bodies choked the little river the locals called the Cock, so that men crossed it on the backs of the fallen. The wind that day mattered. The Yorkist archers, firing downwind, outranged the Lancastrians firing into the gale. The enemy arrows fell short, and the Yorkists walked forward, gathered the spent shafts from the snow, and sent them back. A battle can be decided by which way the weather blows. The bones in the pit are what that decision looks like up close. The men who fell here were fighting the endgame of a quarrel decades old. Years before, the country had a king, Henry VI, whose mind failed him so completely that when his son was born in 1453, he could not recognize the child. Around that hollow throne, two families circled, the House of York and the House of Lancaster, and the war took its later name, the Wars of the Roses, from their badges. The rift had already been bloody. At the First Battle of St. Albans in 1455, the Duke of Somerset was killed outside an inn, and at Wakefield that December the Duke of York himself fell, and his head, crowned in paper, was fixed above the gate of the city that shared his name. His son inherited that severed head as a debt to be repaid. Towton was the repayment. Edward, barely 19, had declared himself king in London that March. He rode north to make the claim true in the only currency that settled it. The men in the pit are the price of a crown. Exhibit 1 is the skull. The damage is a contained hollow, what the pathologists call a pond fracture, a section of the cranium punched inward like the surface of ice giving way under a heel. This is not a graze. This is a great weight of energy funneled into an area the size of a thumbnail. The rim of the fracture is sharp and defined, which tells you the thing that made it had a shaped head, a narrow point, a beak, a fluke. The bone did not simply crack, it caved. To do that through a steel helmet, the weapon had to be heavy. It had to be swung with a man's whole body turning behind it, shoulder and hip and boot all committed to one downward line, and it had to concentrate every ounce of that swing into a single spot. Not a blade, a crusher, a warhammer, or the spike on the back of a poleaxe, the head no bigger than a finger. Picture what that blow did without picturing the man. The helmet held. The bone beneath it did not. Whatever the man inside was thinking in that instant stopped being thought. He would have dropped where he stood, boneless, silent, before the sound of the strike had finished traveling across the field. No cry, no stagger, a body folding into the churned snow, which by then had turned the color of rust in wide patches across the plateau between the villages of Towton and Saxton. One of the skulls from that pit, catalogued by the archaeologists as Towton 25, carried the record of a man who had survived war before. Across the front of it ran an old blade wound, long-heeled, the bone knitted smooth. He had taken a cut to the head years earlier and lived, gone home, fought again. On the day he died, he received wounds to the skull that number in double figures, blade cuts, punches from a squared point, the great caving blow of a hammer, and a slice that took a piece off the back of his head as he turned to run or fell. The healed scar and the fresh ruin sit on the same bone. A man does not gather that history by accident. He was a soldier by trade, likely in his late 30s, and the trade caught up with him on a hillside in the snow. The men beside him tell the wider story. The bones from the pit belong to fighters aged from their teens to their 50s. Their spines and shoulders carried the marks of hard labor and years of drawing the great war bow, the muscle strain frozen into the bone. Several had healed injuries from earlier fights. This was not a levy of frightened farmers. Many were seasoned men, and it did not save them. Exhibit 2 confirms this was method, not luck. A kneecap in the assemblage is not broken, it is pulverized. Fracture lines run out from a single point of impact, like cracks fleeing a stone dropped on glass. You do not get this from a fall. You do not get this from the chaos of a scrum. This is a chosen target, struck deliberately, and its purpose was never to kill. Its purpose was to fix the man in place. A man on his feet, even one already reeling, is still a threat. He can swing. He can grapple. On an ordinary field, he can be worth a ransom, kept alive because he is dangerous enough to demand it. But Towton had no ransoms. The chroniclers agree the order went out before the armies met. No quarter. Kill the commons, spare no lord. The heralds called it the day of the great slaughter. So a man on the ground with his knee destroyed was not a prize to be bargained for. He was salvage waiting to be sorted. The man who delivered that strike was not trying to win a duel. He was working through a sequence he had been taught. Cripple first, the rest can wait. The smallest wounds on these skeletons are the ones that say the most, and they are the hardest to look at without flinching. Fine puncture marks disturb the cervical vertebrae, the small bones stacked in the neck. Slender perforations pierce the thin orbital plate, the delicate shelf of bone behind the eye. These are not the scattered, random marks of a melee. They are placed. They were made at arm's length, to men who were already down, helmets gone, unmoving, past defending themselves. The camera pulls back here, because what these marks describe is not a battle at all. Someone crouched over a fallen man. Someone lifted his head to open the line of the throat. Then a stiff, narrow spike was driven up under the jaw, through the soft gap, hunting the space between the vertebrae to reach the cord that runs through them, or through the eye, the shortest road to the brain. This is not how men die in a charge. This is how they are finished afterward, in cold arithmetic, when the shouting has moved off down the field and the counting has begun. Not a fight. A killing done kneeling. Now we bring in the first of our inheritors, the man who had to deal with what the fighting left behind. Picture him walking the field while the pits are dug. He carries no weapon. He is a Cistercian monk, drawn perhaps from an abbey near the ground, sent by the victors to see the dead into the earth. The order that raised houses like fountains and rewrote built its life on silence, on psalms sung at fixed hours through the dark, on the slow turn of planting and harvest across the granges. Today his day is shaped by the logistics of decay. He does not see knights. He does not see heroes, or even quite men. He sees bodies, hundreds laid bare, pale and waxen in the flat morning light, dragged by the ankles and stacked the way a household stacks firewood before winter. The scavengers came through before him. They took the plate, the padded jacks, the boots, the rings, the coin. They took the faces too, in a way, because stripped of everything, a lord and a ploughman are hard to tell apart. Rank was a thing you wore. Naked in the clay, it is gone. To this monk, the battle is not a tale of valor for a chronicle. It is a problem of rot and sickness spreading toward the living. The smell has already begun to turn. He knows that within days it will be unbearable, that it will draw flies and then fever, and that the villages of Saxton and Towton lie downwind. So He does what his office demands. He calculates how much quicklime to buy, how many laborers to hire from the surrounding manors, and for how many days, how deep the pits must be cut so the ground will hold what it is given. He measures the cost of a battle in shillings and in pence, in cartloads of lime and hours of digging. There is a grim thrift to it. The dead who lay farthest out toward the river were buried where they fell. Those near the road went into ordered pits, aligned head to toe, packed close to save the labor of digging. Some were laid with a strange care despite the haste, arms folded, as if a hand that had killed still remembered the burial rites. Years later, a chapel would be raised on this ground, and money granted so masses could be said for the dead, a debt the crown paid long after the debtors were bone. But that comes later. On this morning, the inheritance is simpler and worse, wreckage, and the task of making it vanish cheaply and fast. If the monk keeps a record of this day, it will not sing. It will speak of the stench, the flies, the depth of the trenches, and the terrible sameness of men who no longer have names. A few feet from the lip of the grave, in the churned mud the burial crews turned over, another scavenger might find something the first pass missed. It is a dagger. It looks nothing like the graceful, cross-hilted weapon a painter would put in a saint's hand. This is a rondel dagger. The grip is a plain cylinder of wood or bone, capped top and bottom by a flat steel disc. The rondel that gives it its name and lets a man drive his whole weight down the handle without his hand sliding onto the blade. And the blade is the point of the thing, not wide, not flat. A thick, rigid, tapering spike, square or triangular where you cut across it, with no cutting edge at all. It is not made to slash. It is made to punch through. Set beside the tools of a trade rather than the arms of a poem, it looks like an awl for driving holes through heavy hide, or an ice pick built for one motion. All artistry stripped away, all function left behind. It is exactly the shape that fits the punctures in the neck bones. Found alone in the mud, it is a key with no lock in sight. Laid against those marks on the vertebrae, it becomes a confession in steel. This weapon had a reputation the chroniclers knew. The French called its cousin the Misericorde, the mercy blade, because it delivered the final stroke to a man beyond saving. There was no mercy in it at Towton. Here it was the instrument of the no-quarter order, the tool that turned a routed army into a body count. The same shape of blade had done famous work before. When the Duke of Orleans was cut down in the streets of Paris on a November night in 1407, killed by hired men working for John the Fearless of Burgundy, it was narrow, thrusting daggers that finished him where he fell, a murder that lit the long feud between Burgundian and Armagnac and helped open France to English invasion. The rondel was the weapon of the ambush, of the pit, of the moment after the fight. It was made for men who were already down, so the skeletons have told us how these men died. Now they pose the harder question. Some of the dead were men of standing. A man of rank could afford the single most expensive piece of technology his century produced. He would have gone into that field sealed from crown to heel in articulated plate, a personal fortress shaped and hammered by masters in Milan, in the workshops of the Misaglia family, or in Augsburg and Nuremberg, where a single fine harness could cost as much as a working farm. Centuries of trial had gone into it. It was built to shrug off arrows, to turn a sword, to make the man inside as close to untouchable as human craft could manage. He was, in every practical sense, a walking tank. And such men ended in the pit too, stripped, skulls caved in, knees destroyed, spikes run up beneath the jaw. Among the Lancastrian dead that day were the Earl of Northumberland and Lord Dacre, killed, the story runs, when he lifted his helmet to drink and took an arrow to the throat. Titles did not slow the blows. The bones prove the murder. They do not explain how the murderer got past the wall of steel. The armor built to make a man invincible is the same armor he was wearing when they killed him. The fortress and the coffin were the same object. Something in the design of the age's protection had a flaw the killers had learned to find, and they found it thousands of times before the sun went down. There is a truth history tends to keep at a whisper. The stories we inherit about the past are a kind of armor, too. A polished surface fitted over a rougher, uglier shape underneath, worn to make the past easier to carry. The chroniclers who wrote of chivalry wrote for patrons who paid in gold and expected to be flattered in return. If you are the sort who would rather lift the plate and look at what the plate was hiding, you already belong here. We built a place for people like you, an inner circle we call the lineage. Joining is more than support. It makes you part of the crew that keeps these investigations running, that keeps forgotten stories told with the depth they are owed, and it puts our work in your hands before anyone else sees it. If you are one of us, join the ranks. The link is in the description. The men in the grave were not killed by swords. On that, the evidence leaves no room. Every serious wound points to a weapon meant to crush, to cripple, or to slip a rigid point through the narrowest gap in a defense. The sword was for lesser men, for the unarmored, for the poor who came to Towton in wool and boiled leather and were cut down in their thousands as they broke and ran for the river with the Yorkist horse behind them. Some of those men never reached the far bank. The cock was small enough to step across in summer. That day it filled with the fallen, until, the chroniclers say, the living crossed dryshod over the dead, and the water ran red for a mile downstream to where it met the wharf. The pursuit went on into the dark, and through the next day all the road to Tadcaster littered with the rundown. To take an armored man, though, you needed other tools entirely, and a colder way of thinking about the job. Their deaths were not events, they were procedures, and we have only examined the last step. To learn how the earlier steps were even possible, we have to turn from the body to the machine it was locked inside. We have to rebuild the cage, bolt by bolt, before we can understand how the creature within it was killed. And the first thing the cage reveals is that it was never quite as sealed as its owner believed. The second piece of evidence is not bone. It is steel, and it is empty. Set a full harness of 15th century plate on a wooden frame, and step back. Milanese work say, from the shops that clustered along the moat of the Porta Ticinese in Milan, where the Missaglia family stamped their mark into the metal and shipped it across Europe on mule trains through the Alpine passes. Not lit like treasure in a glass case, lit like a crime scene, because that is what it is. A silent witness that outlived both the man who wore it and the men who killed him. Every curve, every rivet, every plate riding over its neighbor is the answer to a question asked in blood on 100 earlier fields. Nothing here is decoration. This is a machine built for one purpose, and its whole design is an argument with the sword. Start with what a sword actually is. It is a cutting weapon. Its power lives in the edge, in the line where the steel narrows to nothing. To beat it, armor does not need to be thick enough to stop a blade dead. It needs to be smooth enough that the blade never gets to bite. So every surface on this harness is convex. The breastplate swells outward, the helmet domes, the shoulder rounds under a curved plate. There is not one flat panel anywhere for an edge to catch and dig. Watch a cut land on it. A sword swung hard at the chest does not sink in. It skates. The rounded steel turns the edge aside and throws the blow's whole force off into empty air, and the man inside feels little more than a shove. A stroke to the shoulder slides off the curve. A blow to the head glances down the dome of the helm and away. The suit is a fortress with no straight wall to set a ladder against. Every plane is a ramp built to send steel sliding harmlessly past. The design was not invented in a day. It grew across a century of dead men. At Agincourt in 1415, the French rode into English aerostorms in the older harness of their fathers, and the chronicler Jean de Wavrin, who stood in the French ranks as a boy of about 15, wrote of men so packed and so mired in the ploughed field that they could not raise their arms, falling and smothering under their own weight, while the lightly clad English archers dropped their bows, took up mallets and axes, and went in among them. The shape of armor hardened after fields like that. The armorers learned what killed and reforged the steel to answer it. The harness on the frame before us is that lesson made solid, the fluted, glancing plate of a harder century. A swordsman could stand and hack at a man dressed like this for the length of a sermon, and earn nothing but a chipped edge and burning shoulders. The plate is hardened. It is made deliberately tougher than the blade that strikes it, so the sword loses the argument at the point of contact. Taking a long sword to a good breastplate is like taking a carving knife to an anvil. The wrong tool meeting the wrong material, and only one of them gives. This is exactly why the bone record from Towton is so quiet about clean cuts. Against an armored man, the sword was a sidearm, a badge of rank, a weapon for the poor and the unprotected. Against plate, it was noise. So if the sword did not kill the man on our table, the armor itself tells us what did. Look at the surviving harnesses that hang in the great collections, in the Royal Armouries at Leeds, in the Wallace Collection in London, in the imperial halls of Vienna and Graz. You will not find them raked with slash marks. You will find them pocked with dents, deep, round, ugly craters, hammered into the steel by something blunt and heavy, swung by someone who understood the machine and did not bother trying to cut it. Look at the helmet first. There, at the temple, a clear hollow, the steel pushed inward, and often a small torn hole punched at its center. Lay that against the caved skull from the pit, and the two shapes agree. This is the print of a poleaxe's hammer face, or the beaked fluke on the back of a warhammer. These were the tin openers of the medieval field. They were never meant to cut. They were meant to deliver a shock the armor could not swallow. Here is the cruelty of the physics. The shell need not break for the man to break. When a hammer lands, the plate holds, but the energy does not stay in the plate. It passes straight through the steel into the head behind it. The helmet becomes a struck bell, and the skull inside is the clapper. A blow like that, even one that leaves the bone whole, floods the brain with force. It drops an armored man where he stands, his world shrinking to a white flash, and then nothing. The breastplate carries the same testimony. Not scratches, but blunt craters, the fingerprints of maces and hammers meant to crack the ribs and bruise the organs through the plate. The armor stands as a witness against the sword and for the hammer. It is a ledger of the weapons its owner truly feared, kept in dents. You could hear it, too, on a field like Towton, not the ring of edge on edge that the poems love, but a duller sound, the flat, heavy knock of iron on iron over and over, like a whole village of blacksmiths at work at once in the falling snow. Men who lived through medieval battles named the noise before anything else. The din, one writer called it, that a man could not think through, Add to it the wet cold of that Palm Sunday, the wind driving sleet into visor slits, the mud sucking at every step, until a man could barely lift his foot for the next blow. The battle ran, the chroniclers say, from mid-morning until the light failed, and beyond, the longest day of fighting the country had ever seen. 10 hours of that iron knock, and by the end, men were standing on windrows of their own dead to keep fighting, the lines feeding fresh ranks over the fallen. Now shift the lens to the one who inherited this, not a monk this time, a boy, a squire, 16 or so, whose master rode out that morning and did not ride back. His duty is plain and it is bleak. He is on the field not to mourn a man, but to recover property. He finds the harness near a heap of stripped bodies, battered, mud-packed, and empty, the shape of a man with no man in it. He does not weep, he assesses. His world was never one of banners and vows. It was one of buckles and grease and account books. He had spent 2 years learning to arm his master, and he could do it in the dark. The sequence drilled into his hands, feet first, then the legs, then the body, the helmet last, each strap tightened in an order that never changed. He knows the smell of the padded arming doublet after a march, the cold of the steel before the body warms it, the small click of each buckle finding its hole. He kneels in the churned ground and runs a trained hand across the dent in the helm. He can read the faint bloom of stress in the metal around it. He knows at a touch that no smith will hammer this out. The temper is spoiled, the steel dead. That is a new helm to be forged, and a fine helm is money enough to keep a laborer for years. He works the fingers of the gauntlets, checks the small overlapping plates, and the rows of rivets that let a steel hand close. Several are sheared. A strap on the left greave has been cut clean through, the mark of looters, and something in his jaw sets at the small insult of it. To this boy, the harness is no sacred relic of a fallen hero. It is a wrecked machine and a record of a bad day, and it is a bill. He must carry the sum of it home to a widow and a family. The ruined helm, the broken joints, the lost straps, the war horse gone with the plunder, the sword taken from a dead hand. He is inheriting a debt, itemized in bent steel. The war did not only take the man, it sent the household an invoice, and after Towton that invoice landed on doors across England because attainder followed defeat. Edward's first Parliament, meeting in November 1461, passed acts stripping the beaten families of their lands and titles so that a wife could lose her husband and her home in the same winter. Land seized from the losers was handed to the men who had won. The killing on the field became a redistribution of property on paper, sealed with wax in a chamber at Westminster months after the snow had melted. It is here, kneeling by the empty shell, that the rondel dagger stops being a loose curiosity and becomes the center of the case. Out on the open field, it was only a tool. Set beside the armor, its purpose sharpens to a point. The squire would know it on sight, because he would know it was cut to fit the locks on this exact machine. A harness is not a seamless skin. It cannot be. A man has to see and breathe and bend his arms and knees, so the machine must have openings. Every opening is a weakness, and the dagger is shaped to hunt them. He would look at the slit in the visor, the narrow band left for the eyes. The needle of the rondel slides into it, as if measured for it, and the road beyond runs straight to the brain. He would look at the armpit, where the plates of arm and chest come near, but cannot quite meet, guarded only by a patch of mail and a small floating plate the armorers called a bassaggio. The stiff blade forces the mail rings apart, or slips beneath the plate to reach the lung, the heart. He would look at the palm of the gauntlet, and the groin, and the bend of the elbow, every place the smith had traded protection for movement. He would look at the nape where helmet and gorget leave a thin gap at the back of the neck. Get behind a fallen man, and the point goes in there, seeking the cord. The very armor that made a knight untouchable while he stood had drawn, in its own gaps, a precise map for his killing. The dagger was the instrument of that last act. It was never a weapon of the fight. It was a tool for ending a man who could no longer fight, and it was made with that single job in mind. Because the armor had a second face, and it showed once its wearer was down. Standing, the man was a lord of the field. Fallen, he was a turtle rolled onto its shell. The 60 pounds of steel that carried him forward now pinned him in place. The clever articulation that let him run and strike worked against him flat on his back in the mud. The joints that bent one way would not fold the other, and a man cannot lever himself upright with two attackers kneeling on him and the ground churned to soup. A single foot on the breastplate could hold him there. In that instant, every coin the armor cost, every acre it was worth, every rank it announced, counted for nothing. He was a man sealed in a can, waiting for someone to fit the key to the lock. This was not theory. It happened to the greatest names. At Wakefield, the winter before Towton, the Earl of Rutland, York's second son, and a youth of 17, was caught fleeing the lost field and killed on or near the bridge, run down when the battle was already over. Rank did not shield him. Youth did not shield him. Beside him died his father, the Duke of York, and both their heads were carried to the city walls. The Duke's, the chroniclers say, was set up wearing a paper crown, so his enemies could mock the man who had reached for the real one. That mockery was the debt Edward carried north to Towton and paid in full. At Towton itself, Lord Dacre of Gilsland, a Lancastrian commander, is said to have paused during the long fight, lifted his helmet to take a drink, and been struck in the throat by a single arrow loosed by a boy hidden in an elder tree. He was buried near the field with his horse, and his tomb still stands in Saxton churchyard, the stone worn but legible after 5.5 centuries. One raised visor, one gap, one arrow. That was all the machine's flaw needed. Say the cold fact plainly, because the myths need clearing. A full harness could cost as much as a small farm or a whole village's yearly income, a fortune worn on the body, but it weighed only around 60 pounds, spread across every limb, less than a modern soldier hauls into battle. The men in it were not lumbering iron oafs who tipped over and lay there. They were trained from boyhood to move in it. Surviving fight books and eyewitness accounts show armored men running, vaulting, climbing, scaling ladders, throwing one another to the ground. The 14th century chronicler Jean le Bel marveled that a fit knight could turn cartwheels in his harness. Killing one was never a matter of outrunning a slow giant. It was the patient, deliberate dismantling of a costly piece of hardware with the operator still inside. The evidence we have handled, the bones and the shell, tells one clear story, and it has 2 steps. Step 1, put him down. That was the work of the mace, the warhammer, the poleaxe, weapons of shock, built to stun the man rather than pierce the plate, to turn a standing fighter into a body in the dirt. The dents are the proof of step 1, stamped into helm and breast. Step 2, once he is down and cannot rise, find the way in. That was the work of the rondel, close, quiet, and efficient, made for the moment after the fighting has passed the fallen man by. Understanding that 2-step method is the whole spine of this investigation, If you want to hold a piece of it in your own hands, you can. The book that stands behind this script, the one that lays out these mechanics in full, is available now through the View Products button on your screen. It is a work of patient, unflinching research, an archive of the machinery we have been reading today, and there is no faster way to grasp how deep this subject runs. While you are there, look along the shelf. We have gathered a set of dark relics and themed pieces to sit alongside it. Open the shop, browse the artifacts, and bring a fragment of this history home. So the method stands. We have the body and the shell it died in. We know the man was hammered off his feet, held in the mud, and finished with a spike through a gap in his own armor. The weapons signed their work on bone and on steel, and the signatures match. Towton did not invent the technique. It only wrote it larger than any battle before it, across thousands of bodies in a single afternoon, on a plateau where the plow still turns up buckles and buttons and the odd tooth to this day. But that leaves one question the evidence cannot yet answer, and it is the coldest of all. None of this was rage. None of it was chance. The knee before the throat, the hammer before the dagger, the exact gap chosen at the visor and the armpit and the nape. That is not fury. That is training. Someone was taught where to strike, and in what order, and told to expect a man in the finest armor money could buy. The blows land in the same places, battle after battle, grave after grave, as if every killer had studied the same page. Because somewhere, someone had written that page. A teacher, a drill practiced in a courtyard until the hands knew it without the mind. A manual passed from master to pupil among fighting men, copied by scribes and carried across borders. To learn who set the lesson down and how calmly it was written, we have to open the killer's own handbook. The last piece of evidence is not a body, and it is not a weapon. It is a book. But calling it a book already gives it the wrong shape. It is a manual, a set of working instructions for the taking a part of an armored man. What we are opening is a Fechtbuch, a fight book, and the copy that matters here was drawn up in the first years of the 15th century by a man named Fiore di Liberi, a master of arms from Cividale in the Friuli, in the northeast of Italy, close to the border with the German lands. Treat Fiore as a person because he was one, and a telling one. He was no poet spinning verses for a hall. He was no monk with a quill and a conscience. He was a fighting man who sold his craft, a master who, by his own account, trained knights and men-at-arms for the wars of northern Italy, who names his noble pupils in the prologue and boasts that he was challenged 5 times by rival masters to fight with sharp swords and no armor, and that he came away from every meeting unhurt. He tells us he learned in part from a German master named Johann, and that he guarded his art so closely he would not set it down in writing for men who might turn it back on him. He served the great condottiere companies of his day, the mercenary bands that hired themselves out to the warring cities of Italy, and he mentions instructing a captain before a judicial duel at Perugia. His book, Fior di Battaglia, The Flower of Battle, prepared around 1409 for the Marquis of Ferrara, Niccolo III d'Este, is not a hymn to chivalry. It is a plain, illustrated method for ending a human life, armored or bare. The killer's own textbook. 4 versions of it survive, one now in the Getty in Los Angeles, another in the Morgan Library in New York, the ink still dark on the vellum after 600 years. The first shock comes from what the pages do not show. You open it expecting rows of knights in bright harness, crossing long swords in some noble measure. That is the picture the myth trained you to expect. But that kind of fencing fills only a slice of Fiore's work. Most of the book is given over to something older and closer to the ground. It is given over to wrestling. Abrazare, he calls it, the foundation on which everything else is built. Page after page shows men in full plate with their swords dropped or reversed, locked chest to chest, hands on collars and elbows and knees. They are not exchanging elegant cuts. They are trying to put each other in the mud. The drawings are flat and instructional, each figure marked with a small gold crown or a garter at the knee to show which fighter holds the advantage and which technique defeats which. One sequence shows a master catching the enemy's leg, lifting it, and driving him over backward. Another shows a man slipping inside the guard, seizing the helmet, and wrenching the head down until the balance breaks, and the body has no choice but to follow it to the earth. A third shows a thumb driven up under the rim of the visor to blind and unbalance in one motion. A fourth teaches how to lock an armored elbow until the arm can be snapped. This is not the dance of the tournament yard. This is the science of the takedown, drawn like the plans for a piece of machinery. This is step 1, set down as a diagram. Once the enemy is on the ground, Fiore turns the page to step 2. He gives a whole section to the dagger, and the dagger he draws is the rondelle, the same stiff, edgeless spike we found in the mud beside the grave. Here, the drawings leave nothing to guess. A man in armor kneels on the chest of a downed opponent, pinning the sword arm with his own knee, one hand trapping the wrist. The other hand sets the point of the dagger to the eye slit of the fallen man's helmet. The words that go with the pictures carry no heat at all. Fiore counts the places on an armored body where a dagger kills, and the places where it only wounds. The armpit, the palm of the gauntlet, the groin, the bend of the knee, the throat above the gorget, the eye. He writes of the thrust that enters the face or the visor and names it, flatly, a mortal blow. No mercy in the sentence, no honor, just an anatomy lesson with a fatal ending. In his hands, the crude spike becomes a surgeon's instrument made for the quiet last stroke over a man who cannot rise. And that raises the question the whole system turns on. Why would a master spend his life's teaching on disabling a man, on wrestling him down, on knowing precisely where he can be hurt without being killed? Why not simply teach the killing blow and be done? The answer is the engine underneath all of it, and it is not what the poems say. It was not hatred. It was not loyalty to a lord. It was money. The center of knightly war was the ransom. A living knight, above all a nobleman, was not an enemy to destroy. He was an asset to seize. A man in fine armor was a walking treasury, and taking him alive and unbroken was the largest prize the field could offer. This was not war, as sport dressed in courtesy. It was the most violent trade in Europe, and it ran on a simple sum. A dead knight was worth his armor and his horse. A fair haul, but a fixed one. A live duke held for ransom could be worth more than a walled city. The whole method, Fiore taught, was built to keep the merchandise breathing. Put a number on it, and the number does the arguing. In 1356 at Poitiers, the Black Prince's outnumbered English force took King John II of France alive on the field after his own vanguard had broken and fled. The chronicler Jean Froissart, who gathered his account from men who had been in the fight, describes the English knights crowding so thickly around the fallen king, each one shouting that the prisoner was his, that a Gascon squire named Denis de Morbec had to shoulder through the press and claim him in French before the two men could even understand one another. That single capture carried a ransom of 3,000,000 gold crowns. The figure's hard to hold in the mind, so measure it against what it stood beside. It was roughly twice the yearly income of the English crown. It was enough to run the English war for 2 full years. Gathering it broke the back of France. The monarchy debased its coin, laid crushing taxes on a land already hollowed by the Black Death and by defeat, and drove the countryside into the peasant revolt the chroniclers called the Jacquerie in 1358, which the nobles put down with a slaughter of their own. Still, the ransom could not be paid in full. John came back to captivity in London when a hostage broke his parole and died there in 1364 with the debt unsettled, given a funeral at St. Paul's before his body was sent home to Saint-Denis. One man, taken alive, was priced at a kingdom. That is the machine, and its pull reached down into every choice made on the ground. It shaped the weapons. A sword might kill a valuable prisoner by accident, and an accident like that was a fortune thrown into the mud. A warhammer could drop a man senseless without breaching the plate, leaving the asset stunned and whole and ready to be claimed and named. The tool a man reached for was often a sum done in his head under his breath. Am I trying to kill a soldier, or am I trying to bank an investment? It shaped surrender itself. A knight who knew the trade would yield only to a captor of standing, a man who could be trusted to see the ransom collected rather than cut his throat for the plate on his back. Prisoners were sold on, too. A captor short of cash could pass his prisoner to a wealthier lord for a share, so a single duke might change owners 3 times before the money was ever raised. Kings taxed the trade. By English custom, the crown took a cut of every ransom above a certain value and claimed outright any prisoner of royal blood. War had a price list, and the clerks kept it, and it explains by its absence the particular horror of Towton. There the ransom rule was suspended. Edward's no-quarter order tore up the account book for a single day. That is why the pit near Towton Hall held not lords kept in careful captivity, but common men and lesser knights, finished where they fell in the snow. The economy that usually kept men alive had been switched off, and the killing was allowed to run unpriced from mid-morning until dark, and on into the pursuit down the road to Tadcaster, which brings us to the last inheritor. Not a monk over the pits, not a squire over a ruined helm, but a household far from any battlefield. Picture a manor in the French countryside, the autumn of 1415. The news of Agincourt still moving along the roads faster than the survivors. A courier comes up the track on a spent horse, mud to the girth, the beast's breath smoking in the cold. He does not carry a letter of grief. He carries a folded parchment sealed with the badge of an English captain, a demand for the ransom of the family's eldest son, taken alive on the field near the village of Azincourt. To the family, this document is a slow sentence passed on the whole line. The sum is beyond anything they hold in coin. To raise it, they will sell land the family has held for 2 centuries. They will pledge a daughter's marriage against a loan from a Lombard banker, dismiss servants who have served 3 generations, strip the silver off the table and send it to the melting pot. Perhaps the father rides to the abbey to borrow against next year's harvest and the years after that, mortgaging grain not yet planted. Perhaps a younger brother is sent to England as a hostage to sit in a strange hall until the last coin is paid. The parchment is not an offer to bargain. It is a bill for a single failure on a field they never saw, and it will keep the house poor long after the son they are ransoming is himself an old man leaning on a stick. France, after Agincourt, was full of such households. The flower of the northern nobility had been killed or captured in one afternoon. The Constable of France, Charles d'Albret, dead in the mud. The Duke of Orléans, a poet, pulled alive from under a heap of bodies and led away to spend 25 years a prisoner in England, writing verse to pass the decades. Meanwhile, Burgundy and the English carved the kingdom between them over the wreckage, and the ransomed and the bereaved counted their losses by candlelight. Their story, the story of the people who paid, is the hidden furnace that kept the whole spectacle burning. They were the customers in a market of violence, and the price of the goods was written in ancestral acres and mortgaged daughters. And here, in the ledger of profit and loss, the rondel dagger finds its coldest use. What of the men who were worth no ransom? The lesser knights? The men-at-arms from thin estates? The fighters too broken to be carried off the field alive? To the victors, they were not prizes. They were stock with no buyer, a liability, taking up hands and time better spent securing the men who were worth something. And this is where Fiore's manual reads like an account book. His dagger plays are not only for the high-stakes capture, they are also the method for clearing away the worthless. The coup de grace, the so-called mercy stroke, was rarely about mercy. It was about efficiency, clearing the field of the unprofitable so the winners could turn to the men who mattered. The dagger was the pen that closed those entries. This, too, had its famous day. At Agincourt, in the middle of the battle, Henry V gave an order that stunned even his own men. Kill the French prisoners already taken. A fresh threat gathered at his rear, and the thousands of captives at his back, each of them a fortune on the hoof, became a danger he could not spare men to guard. So the ransoms were cancelled on the spot, and the men-at-arms holding the prisoners balked, because obeying meant destroying their own winnings with their own hands. The chroniclers record the reluctance plainly, and note that the king had to detail 200 archers to carry out what the gentlemen refused to do. It was not conscience that made the men-at-arms hesitate. It was arithmetic. They were being told to set fire to money. Now, go back to the skeleton on the table. Every wound reads as a page from Fiore. The pulverized knee and the cave temple are the work of the poleaxe and the warhammer, the tools of step one of putting the man down, exactly as the pages show. The throws and locks of the wrestling chapters explain how he came to be on the ground and held there in the churned snow, and the fine punctures in the neck and the eye socket answer, mark for mark, to the drawings in the chapter on the dagger. He was judged not worth taking alive. He was a failed investment, and his death drew no tears from anyone standing over him that afternoon. It was a line struck through in an account. Fiore's manual is not a distant curiosity behind glass. It is a step-by-step confession set down decades before the man in the pit drew his last breath to the exact manner of his killing. The image of the shining knight, fighting for honor with his sword, is one of the most successful pieces of storytelling ever built. It was made by the inheritors, by chroniclers on noble wages, by poets hunting patrons, by heralds who counted the dead and then dressed the count in glory, and by the very families who had beggared themselves paying ransoms and needed to believe the money had bought something nobler than a life. They raised a myth to give meaning to a business that had none. But the bones do not flatter anyone. The dented steel keeps no one's secret. And the killer's own handbook, drawn in a master's careful hand, says plainly what the paintings were paid to forget. 3 pieces of evidence from 3 different centuries agree with one another, and the poems are outvoted. The field at Towton is quiet now. Sheep graze the slope down to the little cock beck, and in spring the ground still gives up buckles, arrowheads, and the odd worn coin to anyone who walks it after the plough has turned. A stone cross stands at the roadside to mark the day, weathered nearly smooth. The men in the pit lay unnamed for 5 centuries until a work crew's spade broke into them in 1996, packed so close that the diggers first took the tangle of bone for a single mass. Their harness was gone long before, sold and reforged and sold again, its steel scattered into plowshares and potmens across the county. What survived was never the armor, and never the honor the poets promised them. What survived was the record, in bone, in dented plate, in a master's careful ink, of exactly how a man came to be worth more alive than dead, and what was done, cheaply and without ceremony, to those who were worth neither. That is the story the myth was built to bury, and it is the one the evidence, laid out piece by piece on the table, refuses to let stay in the ground. Thank you for staying to the end of this investigation. If these are the stories you believe deserve telling, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and send this to someone who would rather have the truth than the legend. You've just watched another premium documentary by Ancestral, your ultimate history hub on YouTube. Another video is opening on your screen right now. The next case already laid out on the table. Click it and carry the investigation forward.